Power has a way of protecting its own. A nod between judges, a wink between officers, files that disappear, evidence that never existed. It's a dance Maya Caldwell has watched for years from behind her federal prosecutor's desk, each step choreographed to maintain the illusion of justice while serving something far darker, until tonight 2 police officers see a black woman in a luxury car and decide she doesn't belong. They don't know she's a federal. Power has a way of protecting its own. A nod between judges, a wink between officers, files that disappear, evidence that never existed. It's a dance Simone Ross has watched for years from behind her federal prosecutor's desk, each step choreographed to maintain the illusion of justice while serving something far darker. Until tonight, 2 police officers see a black woman in a luxury car and decide she doesn't belong. They don't know she's a federal prosecutor. She doesn't tell them, because Simone understands something they don't. Sometimes the most dangerous person in a corrupt system isn't the one fighting it from the outside. It's the one who lets herself be swallowed whole, just to expose the rot within. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The clock on Simone Ross's dashboard read 11:42 p.m. as she navigated her silver Mercedes through the quiet streets of Harrow Falls. Her shoulders ached from hunching over case files all day, and her blazer lay discarded in the passenger seat, leaving her in a simple black tank top. The late September air carried just enough chill to keep her alert as it drifted through the cracked window. The streetlights cast long shadows across the empty sidewalks, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere in the normally bustling city center. Simone adjusted the air conditioning, letting out a long breath as she thought about the mountain of work still waiting for her at the office tomorrow. The Thorne case had consumed most of her week, a complex federal prosecution that required her full attention. But tonight, all she wanted was the comfort of her own bed and maybe a glass of wine to help her unwind. The radio played softly in the background, some late-night jazz program that helped ease the tension in her neck. She'd been in the office since 6 that morning, poring over depositions and witness statements. Even now, her mind kept drifting back to key points she needed to address in tomorrow's briefing. Just 15 more minutes, she muttered to herself, fighting back a yawn. Her apartment wasn't far now, and she could already imagine kicking off her heels and sinking into a hot bath. The streets were nearly empty at this hour, making the drive peaceful despite her exhaustion. 2 blocks ahead, Officers Theo Kincaid and Damian Marlowe sat in their patrol car, the engine idling. Kincaid's coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he still nursed it more out of habit than thirst. The cardboard cup crumpled at the edges. Marlowe, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel, scanned the nearly empty streets with predatory focus. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and nights like these, quiet, with just enough chill in the air to keep people indoors, were his favorite for finding suspicious activity. The station's unofficial quota system meant they needed at least 2 more stops before their shift ended. "Check out the Benz," Marlowe said suddenly, straightening in his seat as Simone's car passed them. The red brake lights flared briefly at the intersection before continuing on. His eyes narrowed as he watched the luxury vehicle glide past, taking in the driver's appearance. In the brief moment, she was illuminated by the streetlight. Kincaid's lips curled into a smirk. Awful late for someone to be cruising through this neighborhood. He didn't need to say more. They both knew what he meant. This wasn't the sort of area where they expected to see a luxury car, especially not driven by a black woman at this hour. It was the kind of profiling they'd perfected over years of partnership, the kind that never made it into official reports but filled their arrest quotas. "Let's see what she's up to." Marlowe pulled out smoothly, keeping a careful distance as they followed Simone's car. They trailed her for 3 blocks, watching as she signaled each turn, maintained perfect speed, and gave them absolutely no legitimate reason to stop her. But they didn't need a legitimate reason. They rarely did. Simone noticed the patrol car in her rearview mirror, but kept her breathing steady. She'd been here before. The familiar dance of being followed by police, waiting to see if they'd manufacture a reason to pull her over. Her hand stayed firmly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, her speed exactly at the limit. Years of experience had taught her the rules of this particular game, though her position as a U.S. attorney usually spared her from the worst of it. The flash of red and blue lights, shattered the quiet night. Simone's heart sank, but she didn't hesitate. She signaled and pulled over immediately, positioning her car perfectly against the curb. As she reached for her registration in the glove compartment, she noticed her hands weren't shaking. She wasn't afraid. She was angry, but she'd learned long ago that showing anger to police officers was a luxury she couldn't afford. The interior light illuminated her face as she retrieved her documents, highlighting the exhaustion in her eyes. She'd spent countless hours in courtrooms arguing cases, facing down-hardened criminals and corrupt officials. But this simple act of being pulled over still made her stomach knot with a mixture of rage and resignation. Officer Marlowe approached her window. His flashlight beamed deliberately aimed at her face. Officer Kincaid hung back slightly, his hand resting casually on his holster, a subtle threat not lost on Simone. She squinted against the harsh light but kept her expression neutral, years of courtroom experience helping her maintain composure. License and registration, Marlowe barked, not bothering with any preamble. His tone carried the weight of authority he'd grown accustomed to wielding like a weapon. The beam of his flashlight moved deliberately across the car's interior, searching for any excuse to escalate. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Simone's voice was steady, professional, the same tone she used in courtrooms across the country. Not that they knew that. To them, she was just another target, another opportunity to exercise their power. Without consequence. "You rolled through the stop sign back there." Marlowe lied easily, practiced and polished through countless similar stops. "Did you have anything to drink tonight?" Simone's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She could smell the stale coffee on his breath as he leaned closer to her window, invading her space with practiced intimidation. "No, sir, and I came to a complete stop at every intersection." She kept her voice level, despite knowing that challenging their version of events would only make things worse. "That's not what we saw." Kincaid stepped closer, his flashlight joining Marlowe's in what was becoming an impromptu interrogation. The combined beams created harsh shadows across Simone's face, a calculated tactic designed to disorient and intimidate. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." "I don't consent to leaving my vehicle without probable cause." Simone knew her rights. She'd defended them countless times for others. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter, the leather creaking softly under her hands. But knowledge of the law provided little protection when facing officers who chose to ignore it. Marlowe's face hardened, the friendly facade dropping completely. "I said, step out of the vehicle." Now, his hand moved to his belt, a subtle threat not lost on Simone. The streetlight caught his badge number, 6174, and she committed it to memory, along with every other detail of this encounter. She weighed her options quickly. This situation was escalating exactly as she'd seen happen to so many others. But unlike most people in this position, she knew exactly what was happening and exactly how to document it. Her phone sat in the center console, and as she reached for her seatbelt, she pressed the small button that would start recording audio. "I smell marijuana coming from the vehicle," Kincaid announced loudly, though Simone knew there wasn't any. She hadn't even been in the same room as marijuana in years. The false claim was just another tool in their arsenal, one she'd seen used countless times in cases she'd reviewed. "That's impossible, officer. I don't use drugs." Simone kept her voice level, even as she recognized the familiar pattern. First the traffic violation that didn't happen, then the alleged smell of drugs to justify a search. She'd seen this exact scenario play out in dozens of complaint files that had crossed her desk. "Hands where we can see them," Marlowe snarled, grabbing her wrist roughly as she stepped out, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. The sudden pain shot through her arm, but Simone bit back a cry. She knew any sound of distress would be logged as resisting arrest in their report. The night air felt colder now as she stood exposed on the street, her tank top offering little protection against the chill. The concrete was rough under her feet, and she could feel small pieces of gravel through her thin-soled work shoes. Every sensation, every detail, burned itself into her memory. A few yards away, a young man had stopped on the sidewalk, phone raised to record the scene. He looked to be in his early 20s, wearing a hoodie and jeans, his face illuminated by the blue light of his phone screen. Kincaid noticed him immediately, his head snapping toward the potential witness, a silent message passing between the officers. "Move along," Marlowe shouted, taking a threatening step toward the bystander, his hand shifting to his holster again, a movement that carried clear implications. "This is police business. You interfere, you're going to jail too." The man hesitated, phone still raised, moral obligation warring with self-preservation. But when Kincaid started walking toward him with purposeful strides, the decision was made for him. He quickly backed away and disappeared around the corner, leaving Simone alone with her captors. "She's trying to run," Marlowe suddenly shouted, though Simone hadn't moved an inch. The false accusation echoed off the empty buildings, and before she could protest, both officers had her pinned against the car, her cheek pressed against the cold metal of her own vehicle. The rough treatment was calculated, designed to provoke a reaction they could use to justify further force. Simone had seen it before in countless case files, the escalation of force, followed by claims of resistance that never actually occurred. "I am not resisting," Simone stated clearly, knowing her phone was still recording in her pocket. "I'm complying with all orders. You have no probable cause for this detention." Her words were chosen carefully, laying groundwork for the legal battle she knew would follow. "Shut up." Marlowe's grip tightened painfully on her wrist as he roughly cuffed her hands behind her back. The metal was cold and too tight, cutting into her skin. "You lawyer types think you know everything." The words were spat out with contempt, born of countless encounters with citizens who dared to know their rights. Simone's ears perked up at that. She hadn't mentioned being a lawyer. They were profiling her based on her car, her appearance, and probably her well-spoken manner. Every detail would matter later when she built her case against them. Kincaid was already on his radio, his voice carrying the practiced casualness of someone who'd done this many times. "Dispatch, we need a tow truck at our location. Got a possible stolen vehicle here." The lie was so casual, so practiced, that Simone wondered how many other innocent people had their cars impounded based on similar false reports. She watched as he walked around her car, shining his flashlight through the windows as if searching for evidence to support his false claim. The beam lingered on her discarded blazer, her briefcase in the back seat, all the trappings of a successful professional that somehow made her more suspicious in their eyes. As they roughly guided her toward the patrol car, Simone caught her reflection in her car's window. Her tank top was wrinkled now, her naturally coily hair slightly disheveled from the rough handling. A small scrape on her cheek had started to redden where they'd pressed her against the car. She looked vulnerable, exactly how they wanted her to look, but beneath the surface, her mind was cataloging every violation, every abuse of power, every moment that would soon come back to haunt these officers. Through the window, she watched as a tow truck arrived with suspicious speed, suggesting this was a regular arrangement. The driver didn't even look at her car's registration or ask questions before hooking it up, another piece of evidence for the pattern she was building in her mind. The fluorescent lights of the precinct's booking area cast harsh shadows across Simone's face as Officer Marlowe pushed her through the metal doors. The clock on the wall read 12:17 a.m., but time had taken on a strange, elastic quality since her arrest. The familiar rush of cold air conditioning hit her bare arms, raising goosebumps on her skin. "Name?" barked the booking sergeant, a heavy-set man with thinning gray hair and a nameplate reading Stevens. He barely looked up from his computer screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard with practiced indifference. "Simone Ross," she responded clearly, keeping her voice steady despite the growing ache in her shoulders from the too tight handcuffs. Her wrists were starting to show red marks where the metal bit into her skin. Officer Kincaid stood nearby, filling out his arrest report with quick, practiced strokes. Simone caught glimpses of his writing: combative, uncooperative, suspected intoxication. Each lie added to the growing knot of anger in her stomach, but she kept her expression neutral. "Empty your pockets," Sergeant Stevens commanded. "Remove all jewelry and accessories." He pushed a small plastic bin across the counter. Simone's hands trembled slightly as she removed her mother's sapphire ring, a law school graduation gift she'd worn every day for the past 8 years. Next came her watch, a delicate silver piece that had timed countless legal arguments. Each item felt like a piece of her identity being stripped away. "My phone," she said quietly, reaching for the device that had recorded everything. "It needs to be handed over," Marlowe interrupted, snatching the phone before she could finish. He powered it off immediately, a move Simone knew was calculated to prevent any further recording. What he didn't know was that the audio had already automatically uploaded to her secure cloud storage. The booking process continued with mechanical efficiency, fingerprints pressed into ink, then paper. The flash of a camera documenting her disheveled appearance. Height measurement, weight recorded, identifying marks noted. With each step, Simone felt herself being reduced to a series of numbers and checkboxes in their system. I want to make my phone call, Simone stated firmly, as Stevens began filling out the property receipt. I have the right to contact my attorney. Stevens exchanged a look with Marlowe, the kind of silent communication that spoke volumes about the system's casual disregard for prisoners' rights. Phones are down for maintenance, Stevens replied, not even trying to make the lies sound convincing. You can make your call when they're back up. Simone knew this tactic well. She'd heard about it from countless defendants. Delay the phone call, isolate the accused, hope they'll break down or accept a quick plea deal just to get out. But they'd never face someone who knew their playbook by heart. I need you to document that I requested my phone call at 12:23 a.m., she said, her eyes fixed on Stevens' computer screen where the time was clearly displayed, and that it was denied due to alleged technical issues. Stevens' fingers paused over the keyboard, something in her tone too knowledgeable, too precise, making him look up and really see her for the first time. But the moment passed, and he returned to his practiced indifference. Take her to holding, he grunted to a young officer who had been hovering nearby. Cell 3. The holding cells were located down a narrow corridor that smelled of industrial cleaner and stale sweat. Simone's shoes clicked against the concrete floor, the sound echoing off the institutional green walls. As they approached the cells, she could hear voices, other detainees waiting in limbo, their fate suspended in the slow machinery of justice. Cell 3 was already occupied. 2 women sat on the metal bench that ran along the back wall, while a third paced the small space restlessly. They looked up as the door clanged open, taking in Simone's business-casual attire with varying degrees of interest. "Welcome to the party," said the woman who had been pacing. She was young, maybe early 20s, with intricate braids pulled back in a ponytail. "I'm Nina. Been here since dinner time because Officer Friendly out there decided my tail light was broken." Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Simone sat down on the empty end of the bench, careful to maintain her composure. "How long have they been telling you the phones are down?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Going on 6 hours now," replied one of the other women, an older lady wearing hospital scrubs. "I'm Linda. Apparently I ran a stop sign on my way home from my shift. Funny thing is, there aren't any stop signs on my route home." The third woman, who introduced herself as Denise, had a similar story, pulled over for suspicious behavior, which amounted to driving her own car through what the officers decided was the wrong neighborhood. No phone call, no real explanation, just hours of waiting while the system moved at its own glacial pace. Simone listened to their stories, each one fitting perfectly into the pattern she'd seen throughout her career. But hearing them here, in this cell, made them land differently. These weren't just case files anymore. They were real women, with lives and jobs and families waiting anxiously for news. Time crawled by. Simone used it to memorize details, mentally documenting everything she saw and heard. The officers who passed by, their badge numbers, the conversations they had without realizing she could hear them. Every piece would be evidence later. At 1:45 a.m., the cell door opened again. "Ross," the officer called. "Your lawyer here." Simone blinked in surprise. She hadn't been able to make a call, so how? The answer waited in the booking area. Julian Patterson stood there, his usual impeccable suit looking slightly rumpled, as if he'd dressed in a hurry. His dark eyes scanned her quickly, taking in her condition with professional concern. "The courthouse called me," he said quietly as they were led to a consultation room. "Judge Porter saw your name come up on the night's booking list and knew something had to be wrong. He called me himself." Simone felt a surge of gratitude for the old judge. They'd worked together on numerous cases, and he must have recognized that her arrest warranted immediate attention. But she also felt a pang of guilt. Her privilege was showing. How many others in that holding cell had no one to notice their names, no one to make calls on their behalf? The consultation room was barely bigger than a closet, with a scarred table bolted to the floor and 2 plastic chairs. A camera in the corner blinked steadily, reminding them they were being watched. "Tell me everything," Julian said, pulling out a legal pad. His pen hovered over the yellow paper, ready to document every detail. Simone recounted the events of the night, her prosecutor's training helping her provide a clear chronological account. Julian's expression darkened as she described the false pretenses for the stop, the excessive force, the denial of her phone call. "We need to let them know who you are," he said when she finished. "This ends the moment they realize they've arrested a federal prosecutor." But Simone was already shaking. Her head. "No. Not yet. She leaned forward, lowering her voice despite knowing they were probably being recorded. I need to see this through, Julian. I need to experience exactly what our clients go through. Every delay, every violation, every abuse of power. I need to document it all firsthand. Julian sat back, studying her face. He'd known Simone for years, worked with her on countless cases. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same determination she showed when pursuing a particularly important prosecution. They're going to make this as difficult as possible, he warned. Whitman is the on-call prosecutor tonight. You know how he operates. Simone did know. Hathaway Whitman was notorious for working with corrupt officers, burying evidence that could hurt police credibility, pushing for maximum charges on minimal evidence. His presence made the situation even more perfect. He was part of the very system she aimed to expose. Good, she said simply. Let him show his true colors. Everything they do tonight becomes evidence tomorrow. The journey to night court was brief, but revealing. Simone watched through the transport van's windows as they passed several closer courthouses to reach the one where Judge Townsend presided. The deliberate choice of venue was obvious to anyone who knew the system. The courtroom was nearly empty at this hour. A bored-looking clerk typed quietly at her computer while a single bailiff stood guard. Judge Townsend sat on the bench in his black robes, reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he reviewed the charging documents. Hathaway Whitman stood at the prosecutor's table, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the fluorescent lighting. He barely glanced at Simone as she was led in, his attention focused on a quiet conversation with officers Kincaid and Marlowe. Your Honor, Julian began as soon as they reached the defense table. This arrest is completely without merit. My client is a respected. Save it for the preliminary hearing. Judge Townsend interrupted, his tone making it clear he had no interest in anything the defense had to say. We're here to set bail. Mr. Whitman. The prosecutor straightened his tie as he stood. Your Honor, the defendant was combative during her arrest, showing a clear disrespect for law enforcement. We have concerns about her being a flight risk given the serious nature of the charges. The state requests bail be set at $50,000. Simone felt Julian tense beside her at the outrageous amount. Even he hadn't expected them to go this far for a simple traffic stop turned false arrest. Your Honor, these charges are completely fabricated, Julian argued. My client has no criminal record, strong community ties. Bail is set at $50,000, Judge Townsend declared, already reaching for his gavel. Next case. The rapid proceedings had taken less than 5 minutes. Simone watched as Whitman shared a satisfied nod with the officers, their coordinated efforts achieving exactly what they'd intended, keeping her in custody until she could be processed into the main jail. As they led her back to the holding cell, Simone caught fragments of conversation between Whitman and Officer Kincaid. Good work tonight, the prosecutor was saying. We'll make sure this one learns her lesson about challenging authority. Simone allowed herself a small smile as the cell door closed behind her. They had no idea that every word, every action, every abuse of discretion was building a case far bigger than they could imagine. The next days blurred in a cycle of delayed hearings, high bail, and systematic obstacles. But every injustice only strengthened Simone's resolve. She documented everything, quietly building evidence against the system from within. Finally, the day arrived when Simone was brought to the main courthouse for what was meant to be the final hearing on her case. The tension in courtroom 204 was palpable as Judge Townsend called for closing arguments. Morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. Simone sat at the defense table beside Julian. Her posture was relaxed, despite the gravity of the moment. After a week in custody, everything had led to this. Prosecutor Whitman rose from his seat, adjusting his expensive tie with practiced confidence. He'd spent the morning smugly presenting his case, painting Simone as a belligerent troublemaker who'd endangered public safety by resisting arrest. Your Honor, Whitman began, his voice carrying the smooth assurance of someone who'd never lost in this courtroom. The state has clearly demonstrated that the defendant not only disrespected the lawful authority of 2 decorated officers, but actively resisted their attempts to maintain public safety. Simone watched the performance with quiet focus, noting how officers Kincaid and Marlowe sat straighter in their gallery seats, how Judge Townsend nodded almost imperceptibly at key points in Whitman's argument. The choreography was perfect and perfectly corrupt. The evidence shows a pattern of noncompliance. Whitman continued, gesturing toward Simone. From her refusal to accept the officer's legitimate traffic stop to her combative attitude during arrest. This type of behavior cannot be tolerated in a civilized society. Julian shifted in his chair, ready to present their defense, but Simone placed a gentle hand on his arm. She'd waited for this moment, planned it meticulously. Now everything was in place. Furthermore, Whitman was building to his conclusion. We asked the court to send a message that challenging law enforcement authority will have serious consequences. Your Honor, Simone's voice cut through the courtroom as she rose slowly to her feet. Before we proceed, I have something to say. Judge Townsend's face darkened with annoyance. Ms. Ross, you are not permitted to speak. Your attorney. I speak not as a defendant, Simone interrupted, her voice taking on the commanding tone she'd used in countless federal prosecutions, but as an officer of the court who has witnessed enough corruption in this room to merit a federal investigation. The change in the courtroom's atmosphere was immediate. Whitman's confident smile faltered, Kincaid and Marlowe exchanged worried glances, and even Judge Townsend's practiced judicial demeanor cracked slightly. For those who don't know, Simone continued, removing her glasses and straightening to her full height. My name is Simone Ross. I am not just a defendant. I am a United States attorney for the Maplewood District. The gallery erupted in murmurs. Vanessa Lopez, sitting in the back row, was scribbling frantically in her notebook. The court reporter's fingers froze over her stenotype machine. Officer Marlowe's face had gone pale, while Kincaid gripped the gallery railing with white-knuckled hands. This is highly irregular. Whitman sputtered, looking to Judge Townsend for support. Your Honor, I move to. You'll move nowhere, Mr. Whitman. Simone's voice carried the weight of federal authority. Because right now, FBI agents are executing search warrants at your office, Judge Townsend's chambers, and the police department's internal affairs division. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened. Agent Ramirez entered, followed by several FBI agents in suits. They positioned themselves strategically around the room, their presence making it clear that the normal power dynamics had shifted dramatically. Over the past week, Simone addressed the stunned courtroom. I have personally experienced and documented systematic civil rights violations, witnessed evidence tampering, and uncovered a criminal conspiracy involving members of law enforcement, the prosecutor's office, and the judiciary. Judge Townsend found his voice, though it lacked its usual authority. Ms. Ross, you are out of order. This court will not. This court, Simone cut him off, has been operating as part of a criminal enterprise. Would you like me to detail the deposits made to your offshore accounts by the association you chair? Or should we discuss those training sessions at luxury resorts where cases mysteriously got reassigned? The color drained from Townsend's face. In the gallery, several police officers stood and quietly made their way to the exits, only to find FBI agents blocking their path. Officers Kincaid and Marlowe stared at each other in alarm. Mr. Whitman, Simone continued, her voice carrying just a hint of professional courtesy. I'm particularly interested in discussing the pattern of evidence suppression in cases involving these officers. My office has identified 47 instances where you personally buried evidence of misconduct. The grand jury will find that very interesting. The gallery had grown completely silent. Every eye was fixed on Simone as she commanded the room. This wasn't just a defendant speaking. This was a federal prosecutor unveiling a case she'd built from the inside. Your Honor, she addressed Townsend with deliberate irony. I move that all charges against me be dismissed. Unless, of course, you'd like to explain to the Judicial Conduct Board why you've been accepting payments to coordinate with specific prosecutors and officers. The judge's gavel hand trembled slightly. The power he'd wielded so confidently moments ago had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of federal prosecution. I have spent the past week experiencing exactly what countless citizens have endured in this courthouse. Simone's voice carried emotion for the first time. Wrongful arrests, fabricated evidence, excessive bail, denial of basic rights, all orchestrated by the very people sworn to uphold the law. She turned to address the gallery directly, making eye contact with Vanessa Lopez and the other observers. This stops today, not just for me, but for every person who has been targeted, harassed, and abused by this corrupt system. Agent Ramirez stepped forward, holding up a document. We have arrest warrants for Officers Kincaid and Marlowe, Prosecutor Whitman, and Judge Townsend. There will be more to come as our investigation continues. The next few minutes unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. FBI agents moved to secure the named individuals. Townsend was led from his bench, his judicial robe seeming to shrink around him. Whitman offered no resistance as he was handcuffed, his expensive suit no longer projecting authority. Kincaid tried to push past an FBI agent, but was quickly subdued, while Marlowe simply sat, head bowed, as the cuffs were applied. The same handcuffs they'd used countless times on innocent citizens, now encircling their own wrists. This case, Simone addressed the shocked courtroom one final time, is about more than just one wrongful arrest. It's about a system that has betrayed the public trust, a system that targets citizens based on race and status, a system that protects its own while crushing those it's meant to serve. She gathered her papers slowly, deliberately. Every person wrongfully arrested by these officers will have their cases reviewed. Every conviction tainted by prosecutorial misconduct will be examined. Every judicial decision influenced by corruption will be reconsidered. The morning sun had risen higher, its light now filling the courtroom completely. Simone stood in its beam, no longer a defendant, but a symbol of justice finally being served. Court is adjourned, she declared, knowing Judge Townsend was in no position to do so himself. The gallery burst into chaos as reporters rushed for the doors, eager to break the story of how a U.S. attorney had exposed corruption by allowing herself to be its victim. Simone's thoughts were with Linda, Nina, and countless others who had faced this corrupt system without her resources and authority. Their stories would finally be heard. Their justice would finally be served. The old system of power and corruption had crumbled in a single morning. But Simone knew this was just the beginning. Real change would require more than just arrests and indictments. It would require rebuilding the justice system from the ground up, this time with true equality under the law. As she walked out of the courtroom, Simone's heels clicked against the marble floors that had seen so much injustice. But today, those same floors had witnessed the first steps toward real change. The power structure that had seemed untouchable just hours ago lay in ruins, and in its place, the possibility of true justice began to rise. Agent Ramirez fell into step beside her as they headed for the exit. "Ready to get back to your regular job?" he asked. Simone paused, looking back at the courtroom where she'd just brought down decades of corruption. "This is my regular job, Agent. Pursuing justice wherever it leads." Today, it just led closer to home than usual. Together, they walked into the bright morning light, leaving behind a courthouse forever changed by one woman's decision to experience injustice firsthand in order to expose it to the world. Underscore. The federal courthouse buzzed with unprecedented activity as Simone strode through the main entrance, Ramirez at her side. The morning's events at the county courthouse had triggered a cascade of investigations, arrests, and revelations that sent shockwaves through the entire justice system. Now, just hours later, she prepared to present the full scope of evidence she'd gathered. "Conference room A is secure," Ramirez reported as they walked. "We've got representatives from Internal Affairs, the State Attorney General's office, and the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division waiting." Simone nodded, her heels clicking purposefully against the marble floor. She'd changed from her court attire into her usual prosecutor's suit, charcoal gray, impeccably tailored, projecting the authority she'd temporarily set aside during her undercover operation. "What's the status on the association's documents?" she asked, though she already knew Ramirez would have handled it perfectly. "Teams are processing everything now." The Redwood Association records were particularly interesting. Ramirez allowed himself a small smile. They didn't even try to hide the payments. They were that confident nobody would ever look. They reached the conference room doors, where two FBI agents stood guard. Inside, the long table was crowded with federal prosecutors, investigators, and civil rights attorneys. The wall-mounted screens displayed evidence logs, financial records, and surveillance photos, while boxes of documents covered every available surface. Ladies and gentlemen, Simone addressed the room, her voice carrying the weight of both authority and experience. What we're about to discuss represents one of the most extensive corruption schemes ever uncovered in local law enforcement. She nodded to Ramirez, who began displaying key evidence on the screens. First came the dashboard camera footage from her own arrest, showing officers Kincaid and Marlowe's unfiltered racism and abuse of power. Then financial records appeared, revealing the complex web of payments between the Redwood Association and various officials. This morning's arrests were just the beginning, Simone continued. We've identified at least 37 current and former officers involved in systematic civil rights violations, 15 prosecutors who routinely buried evidence of police misconduct, and 7 judges who coordinated with law enforcement to ensure convictions. The room erupted in murmurs as the scale of corruption became clear. Simone let them process it for a moment before continuing. But more importantly, we've documented over 500 cases of innocent citizens targeted for harassment and false arrest, primarily minorities, primarily professionals, all subjected to the same pattern of abuse we expose today. A senior Justice Department official leaned forward. You're talking about a RICO case? Multiple RICO cases, Simone corrected. The Redwood Association wasn't just covering up misconduct. It was actively coordinating and funding it, training sessions that taught officers how to fabricate probable cause, legal seminars that showed prosecutors how to bury exculpatory evidence, judicial conferences that coordinated case assignments to ensure friendly judges. Ramirez took over, displaying more evidence on the screens. We've got recorded conversations, financial records, witness statements, and internal documents. The association's chairman, William Parker, kept detailed records of every payment, every favor, every case they influenced. Simone watched the faces around the table as the evidence mounted. These were experienced prosecutors and investigators, yet even they seemed shocked by the scope of corruption. This isn't just individual misconduct, she emphasized. This was a systematic effort to use law enforcement as a tool of oppression. They specifically targeted successful minorities, people whose careers and reputations could be damaged by even a false arrest. She gestured to one screen showing a database of arrests. Look at the pattern. Black doctors leaving hospitals after late shifts, Hispanic lawyers working weekend hours, Asian business owners making night deposits. All stopped on fabricated pretexts, all pressured into plea deals to avoid career-ending trials. The Civil Rights Division representative spoke up. How did you get access to their internal database? They gave it to me. Simone allowed herself a small smile. Or rather, they gave it to Vanessa Lopez, the reporter who's been investigating them. Someone in their IT department had a conscience and made sure she got a complete copy. As if on cue, the screens displayed Vanessa's latest article, just published online. The headline read, "Federal Prosecutor Exposes Massive Police Corruption from Inside a Jail Cell. Mitchell has agreed to share all her source material with our investigation," Simone continued, including recordings of Officer Marlowe bragging about their tactics during what he thought was a friendly interview. Ramirez distributed thick folders to everyone at the table. We've organized the evidence into categories: financial crimes, civil rights violations, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. Each section includes verified documentation and witness statements. Simone moved to the head of the table, commanding everyone's attention. But the most damning evidence came from Judge Townsend himself. In his arrogance, he kept detailed records of every case he fixed, every defendant he pressured into a plea deal, every piece of evidence he helped suppress. The screen showed excerpts from Townsend's personal files, spreadsheets tracking payments received, notes about which cases needed special handling, even performance evaluations of officers who excelled at targeting minorities. He thought these records proved his value to the conspiracy, Simone explained. Instead, they provide us with a roadmap of corruption stretching back 15 years. A prosecutor from the state attorney general's office raised his hand. What about Officer Marlowe? There are rumors he's willing to cooperate. More than willing, Ramirez confirmed. After this morning's arrests, he contacted our office through his lawyer. He's ready to detail everything: the training programs, the selection of targets, the coordination with prosecutors and judges. Simone nodded. His testimony will be valuable, but we don't need it. The evidence we've gathered is overwhelming on its own. Marlowe's cooperation just helps us understand how deep the corruption went. She moved to another screen, showing a map of similar patterns in neighboring jurisdictions. And this isn't isolated to one courthouse or police department. The same association has been funding similar operations across the state. The room grew quiet as the implications sank in. This wasn't just about cleaning up one corrupt department. It was about exposing and dismantling a systemic abuse of power that had destroyed countless lives. I've assigned teams to begin reviewing every case involving these officers, prosecutors, and judges, Simone announced. Every conviction will be examined, every plea deal scrutinized, every victim contacted. Ramirez added, "We're also tracking the money." The association's donations came from some interesting sources, including defendants who mysteriously had charges dropped after making six-figure contributions. Simone walked to the window, looking out over the city. This goes beyond individual corruption. It's about belonging, about being part of an exclusive club that operates above the law. That sense of invulnerability was what ultimately brought them down. The afternoon wore on, each department coordinator reporting progress, specialized task forces to handle victim outreach, public defenders reviewing cases, civil rights attorneys drafting lawsuits, forensic accountants tracing offshore accounts. The day ended with a press conference on the courthouse steps. Simone stood before a forest of microphones, cameras flashing, as she detailed the corruption they'd uncovered. "Today marks the beginning, not the end," she declared to the assembled media. "We will follow this investigation wherever it leads. We will hold accountable everyone who participated in this corruption, from the officers who made false arrests to the officials who profited from injustice." Vanessa Lopez's hand shot up first during questions. "Ms. Ross, did you plan to be arrested, or did officers Kincaid and Marlowe unknowingly target a federal prosecutor?" "They chose me," Simone replied, "just as they chose hundreds of other successful minorities who they thought they could intimidate and control. The only difference is, I was in a position to fight back and expose their corruption." Another reporter called out, "What about the other victims? The ones who took plea deals to avoid losing their jobs or spending time in jail?" "Every case will be reviewed," Simone assured them. "We've established a special task force to examine all arrests and convictions involving these officers and officials. Anyone who believes they were wrongfully targeted should contact our office." As the questions continued, Simone noticed familiar faces in the crowd. Nina from the holding cell, now standing proudly with other victims. Hospital staff who'd been targeted during shift changes. Business owners who'd lost money to impound fees and legal costs. All of them watching as the system that had victimized them was finally exposed. Back in her office that evening, Simone reviewed the day's developments with Ramirez and Julian. The arrests had already triggered a wave of cooperation from lower-level officials eager to save themselves. "4 more judges have contacted us," Ramirez reported, all claiming they have evidence of similar corruption in their jurisdictions. Julian added, "And the public defender's office is swamped with calls from people wanting their cases reviewed. They're setting up a special unit just to handle these appeals." Simone nodded, satisfied with the progress but knowing this was just the beginning. "What about the police union? Any reaction to Marlowe's cooperation?" "They're in damage control mode," Ramirez replied, "trying to paint this as a few bad apples rather than the systematic corruption we've proven. But their own financial records tell a different story." Simone allowed herself a small smile. Amazing how quickly things change when people realize they might be held accountable. Vanessa Lopez's latest article dropped online, revealing more details about the association's operation. The story included interviews with former officers who confirmed the systematic targeting of minorities and the pressure to meet unofficial quota requirements. "Your case broke the dam," Vanessa told Simone. "People who were afraid to speak up before are coming forward now. I've got former cops, court employees, even judges from other districts wanting to expose similar corruption." The impact rippled through every level of the justice system. Law firms specializing in civil rights cases were flooded with calls. Police reform activists found their message suddenly gaining mainstream attention. Community leaders who had long complained about discriminatory policing were finally being heard. Late afternoon brought another wave of developments. The FBI raid on Judge Townsend's vacation home had uncovered a hidden safe containing records of payments and correspondence with other corrupt officials. He documented everything, Ramirez marveled, spreading photos across Simone's desk, meeting dates, payment amounts, which cases needed special handling, even personal notes about favored officers. His arrogance is our best evidence, Simone said, scanning the documents. It ties him to multiple conspirators across multiple jurisdictions. The next day, the city woke to find its once revered institutions in disarray. Local news led with footage of police chiefs resigning, judges being investigated, and entire units within the department being disbanded. Standing at her office window, Simone reflected on how drastically the landscape had changed in just a month. Once untouchable figures now faced indictments, while the voices of countless victims had finally found an audience. The system had shown its worst face during her week in custody, but now it was being remade, forced to confront its own corruption. For every officer who resigned in disgrace, a new recruit underwent rigorous, transparent training. For every judge who was disbarred, a new standard of accountability was established. For every wrongful conviction overturned, a life was set back on course. Simone's phone buzzed with a final message from Nina. "We did it. We're free." She allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Yes, they were free, and the city was free from the stranglehold of corrupt power that had abused so many. There was more work to do, of course. New reforms had to be implemented, new leaders elected or appointed, new policies drafted. But the fear was gone, the sense of hopelessness that had paralyzed the community. In its place, something new was growing: trust, determination, and a belief that the justice system could serve everyone, not just the powerful. Simone turned from the window, gathering her keys and bag. Agent Ramirez waited by the door, a stack of fresh evidence files in his arms. Together, they would continue the work, exposing injustice, prosecuting the guilty, and ensuring the innocent found a voice. How many others out there would follow her example, letting themselves be swallowed by corruption just to expose it from within? Simone hoped her story would inspire not just prosecutors and officers, but everyday citizens to demand accountability. What would you sacrifice to expose the truth? How far would you go to tear down a system built on decades of injustice? Simone Ross chose to become a victim to expose the villains, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is the willingness to experience it firsthand.